Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. We ask that if you haven't done so already on your way out, would you please sign in? We track zip codes. All we need is your zip code at the reception desk. Some of you might have noticed that we switched from the third Friday to the fourth Friday of the month. And the reason so, the Lancaster Council for the Arts has Food Truck Friday from 11 to 2. They're right over here at the Dunlap Main Street intersection. And today it's Cairo's, Spice of Light, and Fat Cat Cupcakes by Sharon, who's a local baker. So take advantage of that today, and if not, do that in the future. A little plug for our April 28th Lunch and Learn. That's the next one up. We're going to have Professor Pat Lawrence, who's with us today. He has a book out called Obscene Gestures, Counter Narratives of Sex and Race in the 20th Century. He'll be doing a presentation on that, and hopefully we'll have some books to sell if anyone is so moved by his presentation that they just have to have a copy of his book. Today, I'm happy to introduce our colleague, Dr. Amy Gerald. She has a PhD from UNC Greensboro. She has a MA from Appalachian State, and she has a BA from Wake Forest. And the dean of our campus, Walt Collins, is also a Wake Forest graduate, and he gave a big thumbs up behind your back. But we're happy that we were able to entice Dr. Gerald to this side of the South Carolina-North Carolina border, where she's now assistant professor of English here on the Lancaster campus. She teaches courses in rhetoric, women's literature, composition theory, and pedagogy. Always have to be careful saying that word. Her scholarship lies at the intersection of feminism, rhetoric, and writing, with work appearing in journals such as Composition Studies, Feminist Teacher, the Journal of Advanced Composition, and in the collection, The Teacher's Body, Embodiment, Authority, and Identity in the Academy. The work featured in this presentation today stems from a research grant exploring the rhetorical agency of Sarah and Angelina Grimke that developed during their youth here in South Carolina, and appears in PATHO, the Journal of the Coalition of Feminist Scholars in the History of Rhetoric and Composition. So without further ado, those of you in cyberspace, if you don't mind turning off your microphones, please. Warm welcome for Dr. Amy Gerald.
So my mute's off already.
Yeah.
Okay. Hey, thank you everyone for being here. I am really excited to be a part of this lecture series here at the Native American Studies Center. And also to be talking about these exceptional women during Women's History Month. It's fitting to celebrate women's accomplishments at the same time as we remember the struggles of so many women to achieve some measure of equality. Today, we have women in key positions almost everywhere. Heads of corporations like Mary Barra, the first woman CEO of GM. More women than ever in political leadership positions. Our 118th Congress has a record number of women, 28% of Congress is women. The South Carolina legislature, by the way, only 14%, so we're gonna have to work on that a little. Our provost, Dr. Arnett, is a woman. Dr. Elkins, our chancellor, Palmetto College woman. And so there are many, many more examples of women who have stood up, spoken out, and broken the glass ceiling in all aspects of the working world, become leaders in private business and public service. And while there's by no means parity, these women in public life join a long and often unheralded tradition of women's active, vocal, public participation in the world. And it wasn't always this way, obviously. In the history of the world, women as a group have not been allowed to have a public voice. Until quite recently, relatively speaking, it was considered improper for a woman to give a speech in public. Women who gave speeches in the 19th century were called promiscuous and were ridiculed and ostracized and threatened. So women who believed in an idea enough to speak out had to overcome physical, cultural, social, religious, and legal obstacles to actually claim the right to speak in the first place in order to advocate for change. Over the last 50 years, feminists in the United States have discovered, uncovered, and recovered some of the women who, despite social, cultural, religious, and civic pressures and limitations, found the means and the opportunity to express themselves for the betterment of their lives and the lives of others. South Carolina native Sarah and Angelina, actually Angelina and Sarah, Grimke, the subjects of my research, are part of this rhetorical tradition. They were the daughters of Mary Moore Smith, who was a great-granddaughter of the first Landgrave Smith, and John Fauchereau Grimke, who was a Revolutionary War hero, a Charleston lawyer, a planter, a judge. Sarah and Angelina grew up in the late 18th century and early 19th century Charleston, also spending some months, Sarah, I think more than Angelina, in one of their farms in what was called Union Territory at the time. This is an 1823 map of what was called the Union District. And this is a closer look at where the property was, and kind of on a more modern map near Highway 56 and 49, that area. So about an hour and a half west of here. Smart and privileged, both girls were well educated to the extent that women were educated. And even though they were immersed in a wealthy society where slavery was the norm, somehow they came to that realization without much outside influence that slavery was wrong. Let's see. During their childhood and teen years, both girls bucked the system. Sarah secretly taught a slave girl to read, Angelina constantly pressing her family to free their slaves. Legend has it that 4-year-old Sarah saw a slave woman being whipped and was so upset she runs out of the house, through the streets to the harbor, where she tried to find a ship that would take her away. When Sarah was a teenager and Angelina a small child, Angelina saw a small slave boy who had been beaten and was really upset by his injuries. And she ran to her big sister for an explanation, and Sarah had no explanation to give. After years of beating their heads against walls, first Sarah and later Angelina left Charleston for Philadelphia, where they joined the Society of Friends, a sect known for allowing women to take public roles, and eventually became leading abolitionist agents, giving speeches, writing essays and letters, organizing abolitionist groups across Pennsylvania, New York, and New England. Sarah was hesitant to speak. She was not known to be the best speaker. She was more comfortable in writing. So she wrote public letters defending the right of women to speak out against slavery. She is credited with developing the first comprehensive modern feminist theory because she distinguished sex from gender, which you'll see when I read this slide. She connected women's subjugation to their lack of education and to sexual oppression. She took race and class into consideration. She saw that women must acquire a feminist consciousness and practice asserting their rights. And she saw the personal as political. So this is a lot that she covered in the 19th century that didn't become very common to discuss in feminist circles until the 20th century. This slide here is from Letters on the Equality of the Sexes and the Condition of Women from 1838. And she said, intellect is not sexed, strength of mind is not sexed, and our views about the duties of men and the duties of women, the sphere of man and the sphere of woman are mere arbitrary opinions, differing in different ages and countries and dependent solely on the will and judgment of erring mortals. Okay. Angelina was the gifted speaker. She was the first woman to speak to a legislative body in the United States. The next couple of slides are going to show a speech at Pennsylvania Hall, May 16th, 1838. So the abolitionist societies needed a place to give their speeches, needed a place to meet. So they came together, raised money, and built this building, Pennsylvania Hall, they called it. And it opened, I think maybe the 14th or 15th of May, right around there. It was a brand new building. And there was, a conference for abolitionists to speak. But there were mobs outside of the building every day, yelling things, eventually throwing bricks in windows. They were not happy to have abolitionists gathering there and speaking. So this is an example of how she uses what's going on around her in her speech. Instead of ignoring it and blowing through it, she's incorporating the mob into her speech. So she says, men, brethren, and fathers, mothers, daughters, and sisters, what came ye out for to see? A reed shaken with the wind? Is it curiosity merely, or a deep sympathy with the perishing slave that has brought this large audience together? And then there's a yell from the mob outside of the building. She says, those voices without ought to awaken and call out our warmest sympathies. Deluded beings, they know not what they do. They know not that they are undermining their own rights and their own happiness, temporal and eternal. Do you ask, what has the North to do with slavery? Hear it, hear it. Those voices without tell us that the spirit of slavery is here and has been roused to wrath by our abolition speeches and conventions. For surely liberty would not foam and tear herself with rage, because her friends are multiplied daily and meetings are held in quick succession to set forth her virtues and extend her peaceful kingdom. This opposition shows that slavery has done its deadliest work in the heart of our citizens. So that day, when that day of speeches was over, the mob was still out there. The women and people that were there with her, they had to join arms and walk out together to kind of have the courage to meet the mob and get through. The next day, however, the mob comes in and actually burns the building down. And there is some suspicion that the police stepped back and allowed it to happen. So their lecture activity was actually fairly brief, only just spanning a few years. But their influence on the abolitionist movement at the time and the women's rights movement later was considerable. They knew everybody at that time. They knew William Lloyd Garrison, the Beecher family, Frederick Douglass, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. They knew Emerson and Thoreau. They're part of that crowd. As Southern women who grew up in a slaveholding family, they were uniquely positioned to describe to their audience the horrors of slavery. That was what they were bringing to the table and what made them so popular. Paired with the accounts of escaped slaves and aligned with the American Anti-Slavery Society, Sarah and Angelina Grimke provided the movement with effective arguments for the immediate abolition of slavery. Even after retiring from the lecture circuit, the sisters helped compile and added their recollections to a book called American Slavery as It Is, Testimony of 1,000 Witnesses, which was the second most influential abolitionist tract after Uncle Tom's Cabin. And Harriet Beecher Stowe said that she consulted that book in order to write Uncle Tom's Cabin. So despite their renown, today there is, or rather when I started this research, there was a distinct lack of public acknowledgement of the Grimke sisters in South Carolina and in Charleston in particular. In a city of monuments, there is no monument there to these women whose work helped to change the lives of really all of its citizens. So this presentation examines the silence surrounding the sisters, presents my efforts to find Sarah and Angelina in Charleston, and chronicles my collaboration with the Charleston Museum to build a sense of public memory about them. The end result is a richer picture of their lives, their work, and the development of their rhetorical agency while at home in South Carolina. Most people I talk to have not heard of them. My students, most of whom were born here, attended South Carolina public schools, had really no knowledge of their contribution to abolition or women's rights. While diaries, letters, speeches, and essays provide documentation of their public lives in the North, there is very little record, public or private, of their early lives in the South. So when you don't have anything as a researcher, then how do you find your answers when there are few written records readily available? In Remembering Sappho, New Perspectives on Teaching and Writing Women's Rhetorical History, Jessica Enoch and Jordan Jack describe a method in women's rhetorical historiography, how history is written, which asks researchers to look at the absences and the silences, the places where there are questions rather than places with ready answers. They say that the question is not so much whether these women are remembered or forgotten, but how they are remembered and forgotten. So given the public opposition to the Grimkes sisters in 19th century Charleston, as well as their absence from public memory today, these women seem to be forgotten on purpose and possibly remembered only kind of hesitantly and awkwardly. For instance, an early 20th century request for information, this was 1909, about the sisters from Louisa Poppenheim, who was a publisher of a magazine called The Keystone. It was a magazine for women's groups across South Carolina. She requested information on the sisters, and it was met with this response from A.S. Sally, who was the secretary of the Historical Commission of South Carolina. He said, "Those women were unbalanced mentally, morally, and socially, and the capable historical or literary critic of today would anywhere regard it as a case of hysteria to see them put down as exponents of the best in the South." Poppenheim was urged to, quote, "kill the myth if you can and stick a steel pen charged with your brightest sarcasm into its carcass if you cannot kill it." This vehement reaction from a public official charged with protecting and promoting South Carolina's history suggests that the suppression of connections between the Grimke sisters and the South was at one time at least purposeful on an institutional level, not merely an accident of history. So public memory. If public memory is the way a society views its history, a set of beliefs that are constructed by that society to help it understand itself, it can be inferred that collectively Charleston and South Carolina do not see or do not present the fuller picture of their important history. The way our history is presented to our children in the schools creates a sense of this public memory. Museums, monuments, also both represent and influence our sense of public memory. And there are many studies about the way humans choose to represent history, how archives are compiled, how exhibits are developed. Rhetorician and philosopher Kenneth Burke articulated the concept of terministic screen, which this graphic maybe helps us understand a little bit. It's a symbol system or set of words or terminology like a filter, like an Instagram filter, through which we view and understand our world and through which we use language and make meaning. So different cultures, eras, countries, and even professions have their own set of terministic screens through which they view their own situation. Like the medical community, for instance, use a set of medical terminology that few of us really understand with any depth. He said that if you buy into or have faith in a particular worldview, like the slaveholding South did, and operate within its terministic screen, you will undoubtedly find validation for that worldview. The set of terms or the screen influences how you see and operate within your world, deepening your understanding of that world in some aspects, but eliminating the possibility of other viewpoints. In other words, our terministic screens direct our attention toward one worldview and away from another. Social media algorithms function in much the same way today. It takes very purposeful critical thinking to begin to question our assumptions and see other worldviews. From a Burkean perspective, then, the Grimke sisters' absence in Charleston, and by extension, the absence of the notion of abolitionist sentiment in the 19th century South, perpetuates a limited sense of the city's history, directing the attention of the public away from slavery, abolition, and women's rights, and toward the genteel architecture and colonial character of Charleston. In the early 20th century, Charleston's efforts to pull itself out of decline by purposely going about making the South of Broad area historic has, in essence, whitewashed much of Charleston's history for its visitors, and decades later, even for its residents. By choosing one set of memories to preserve, it sort of neglects another. So this perspective, the recognition of a narrative's tendency to direct the attention through one terministic screen, can, when you pair it with the feminist historiographic stance of looking at the absences and the silences, really reveal what is hidden or forgotten or ignored. So by noting what is there and how it's presented and why, we can then look at what's not presented, right? And an examination of the rhetorical acts of historic preservation and representation points to possible motives, causes us to ask questions, and offers ways to create a more inclusive presentation of history. So when I moved to South Carolina years ago, I've lived here 2 different times, I included Angelina and Sarah Grimke in my courses more regularly and with more depth because both women provide strong examples of rhetorical appeal for study, as you could see from the speech and the little blurb from Sarah, but also because I wanted to include South Carolina women whenever I could. I felt that students needed to have exposure to their own, people. The more I taught with them, the more interested I became in their early lives and in discovering what it was about their place that informed their ethos, their persona. Filled with questions, I began searching for the Grimkes on trips to Charleston and the surrounding Low Country. Upon a visit to Magnolia Plantation, which is, you all probably know this one, I watched an introductory film about the Drayton family who still owns the property, and the Reverend John Grimke Drayton, who began its gardens in the 19th century. The film indicated that this Drayton was a nephew of Angelina and Sarah. After the tour, I asked the interpreter about the family connection, and she said that the Grimke townhouse was on Church Street in Charleston. So I go into town and I'm walking up and down Church Street, trying to find any sort of historic marker that would help me. And I ended up finding the Hayward Washington House, one of several historic homes in the city open to the public. For $10, I took the tour, hoping to hear something about the Grimke sisters, but there was no mention of them. Built in 1772, the house, beautifully and painstakingly restored to reflect a colonial era Charleston home, not the antebellum single house with piazza that we are, commonly associate with Charleston, but it's a colonial era home. It is on the National Register of Historic Places because it was owned by a Declaration of Independence signer, Thomas Haywood Jr., and because George Washington stayed there on his tour of the Southern states in 1791. So there's the house. And oops, I'm gonna do that. There's the interior. And you can see if you've been in other colonial era, historic homes, recognizing the paint colors and the style of the furniture and so forth. So it's very much colonial house. And there is the back gardens of the house. Okay. So on the National Register of Historic Places. So I was thinking, well, maybe I have the wrong house. Maybe this is not the place. So after the tour, I asked the interpreter if the Grimkes ever lived there. And she said, yes, they did live there after the Hayward family. Later, I confirmed through the National Historic Registry website that in 1794, the home was sold to, quote, a Mr. Grimke. So I was buoyed by my sleuthing there, but I became irritated by how difficult it was to find information on Sarah and Angelina in Charleston. All I had found so far were indirect, kind of incidental indications of their presence in the area, mostly just brought about by my own questioning. And I'm first wondering, why is this the case? And shouldn't a historic site include as many significant aspects of its history as possible? And is it not possible that some of the artifacts found on the property belong to Sarah, or not Angelina, because she was born in the next house, but Sarah or her parents or other siblings? Was the patriarchal lens of so much of our written history kind of eclipsing Sarah and Angelina, in favor of talking about Hayward and George Washington? The relative silence surrounding the Grimke sisters seemed incredible to me, given other historic sites' efforts to present a more inclusive picture of history today. For instance, historic Jamestown, Virginia, there on the right, is the site of the first permanent English settlement in North America. It presents its story as, quote, a coming together of people from 3 continents, Native American, English, and African, with the park's introductory film discussing the colony from each perspective in the 3 different voices. Another notable example of a straightforward presentation of the darker, uncomfortable aspects of our nation's history is the slavery at Jefferson's Monticello Paradox of Liberty display that was at at the Smithsonian in 2012 when I saw it, that is now a permanent exhibit at Monticello. It examines Jefferson's contradictions as a slave owner and shaper of our country's principles of liberty and equality, complicating and enriching our understanding of our American heritage. And while not necessarily integral to the primary house tours, it is notable that the major Charleston area plantations, such as Middleton Place, have developed separate tours, exhibits, educational programs about the experience of enslaved Africans. These are examples of historic sites whose managers, whether it's the National Park Service, Historic Society foundations, private owners, have made the decision to present a fuller, albeit darker and more complex picture of history to the public. In essence, shaping a public memory that not merely includes but integrates the stories and perspectives of American Indians and African slaves. Charleston has taken steps to include the African-American experience, notably the International African-American Museum's long-awaited grand opening, which is June 27th of this year. Yet, the story of the slave trade is not really integrated into the fabric of the city today, as was the trade itself prior to the Civil War. I began to investigate in earnest the silence surrounding the Grimkes. I threw myself into the city, listening to tour guides, tourists, the librarians and archivists and fellow researchers, always with the goal in mind to locate these Grimkes in Charleston, to find some evidence of them. In particular, I listened for the language used to talk about them and when they were even talked about. My first stop was the College of Charleston Special Collections. As I was reading, a young man came in to request some materials. As he sat down to read, he asked me what I was researching. When I told him, he said that he knew who they were, but they were notorious and not subjects that were brought up. Yes. He turned out to be a carriage driver who was doing research to help him answer questions on his tours. So that a tour guide in Charleston knew about the Grimkes but knew not to acknowledge them implies that the Grimkes are being ignored on purpose. The next day, I took a popular 2-hour walking tour of the city. There was almost no discussion of the role of slavery or the role of women. Highlights of the tour were churches, houses of architectural interest, evidence of the old city wall and the harbor. And this discussion was indeed about Charleston at its economic and cultural peak, which was, leading up to the Revolutionary War. Even though the slave trade was ubiquitous in the colonial era, I believe that people mostly connect slavery with the antebellum period, like Gone with the Wind is what runs through the average person's mind. So the tour I took purposely focused the attention away from the unpleasantness of slavery. The guide began the walk with the admonishment, if you think you're going to see Gone with the Wind, you're wrong. Charleston is a colonial city. Peopled mostly by Northern tourists, and I know this because the tour guide asked where everyone was from. It was when we reached White Point Gardens when a woman asked about race relations in Charleston. The guide, a 40-year resident of Charleston, originally from Connecticut, said that it was good as it is anywhere. The tourist commented that it seemed hard to believe because of slavery. The guide then remarked that arrogant Northern abolitionists would speak of slavery, but they had never been to the South. And of course, I point out that Sarah and Angelina Grimke were abolitionists from Charleston and did give witness to the horrors of slavery. Acknowledging the Grimkes, the guide quickly backtracked and said, I was responding to the original question. Stumbling through this exchange, the guide was clearly uncomfortable discussing slavery and race. She made the point that the original slave traders were Portuguese, Spanish, and Dutch, and that the English began trading to avoid paying tariffs to foreign countries. Now that's true, but it was almost as if that information were meant to defray blame rather than acknowledge any complicity. So again, I found myself wondering at the reticence to look the thing in the face. Is it a desire just to get past slavery, to not be defined by our slave past? As a Southerner, I can recognize this perspective, as I can also see the stubborn resistance to the insistence from outsiders that the South acknowledge and deal substantively with its past. Yet, as historian Gerald Lerner says, such collective forgetting of the dark side of events is hurtful to the individual as well as to the entire society, because one cannot heal, nor can one make better decisions in the future if one evades responsibility for the consequences of past actions. The frank presentation of slavery in the Jamestown settlement, the Jefferson exhibit, even like the old Slave Mart Museum in Charleston, more inclusively reframes the collective memory, as could a frank acknowledgement of the Grimke sisters and abolition. Capitalizing on these Native daughters is a good thing for Charleston. So encouraged by my discoveries, I was compelled to do something in a more tangible way to increase the public memory of the Grimkes. Since museums and monuments are sites for the construction of public memory, one way I could help insert them in Charleston's public memory was to approach the museum that runs the Hayward Washington House. Known as America's first museum, the Charleston Museum was established in 1773 by the Charleston Library Society. Today, it's comprised of its main location on Meeting Street, where it houses collections emphasizing Charleston's and coastal South Carolina's natural and material culture, such as textiles, silver, furniture, Revolutionary and Civil War artifacts, and even prehistoric fossils. It operates 2 museum houses that are National Historical Landmarks, and one of those is the Hayward Washington House. So concerned by that lack of public acknowledgement, my goal was to convince the museum to create some sort of display in the Hayward Washington House. So first, I wrote a pretty well-crafted letter, I'd say, to the director of the museum, opening with my appreciation of the Hayward Washington House and transitioning to my mission and my rationale. Followed up with a phone call, and we set up a meeting. And at the meeting, we had the director there, the assistant director, a chief interpreter of historic houses. We talked about my findings, interesting connections with their research, and then my proposal. They pointed out that the purpose of that house was to show colonial life and furniture, like that's the mission of that house, but still agreed to a very small display in that house. And this is how small it was. Wait a minute. There we go. They agreed to a small display in the house because of the sisters' historical significance. Since then, I've learned that they've put a larger display actually at the museum itself. I offered to help. In the space of a few months, we worked together to place in the front room a picture of the sisters and some words about their achievement. and the family connection to the house. So yeah, a small step, but an important one, because now every time the guide brings people in, they look at that shelf and it prompts them to talk about the sisters. So Enoch and Jack say that the rhetorical practice of remembering women can reshape ideas in the contemporary moment about who women have been and who they might become. So it was and is my hope that this small step provides the casual tourist and the researcher new points of access to the Grimkes sisters and a richer sense of the history of Charleston and its connection with abolition and women's rights. I do have some updates. So there's nothing like an Oprah's book club book to make things happen. Around the time that I was working with the Museum of Charleston, there were efforts by the College of Charleston Friends of the Library to have a national historical marker put on the property of the home that Grimkes moved to after that Church Street house. So like the Church Street house, this house here at 321 East Bay Street, it already had a historical marker, but this was a local one. It was the Historic Charleston Foundation marker. And they called it the Blake House for the planter and the slaveholder who originally built it. It is now occupied by a law firm, but the law firm itself was very happy to have the attention and fully supported the efforts. Also around that same time, fiction writer Sue Monk Kidd published The Invention of Wings. Anybody read the book? Yes. Which is a fictional account of Sarah's childhood and her relationship with her enslaved companion, Hetty, or Handful, they called her. The attention from this book seemed to be what pushed it over the top, with the resulting historic marker. There's her book. There's the marker. Dedication ceremony. They had a dedication ceremony marked by speeches from Sue Monk Kidd and the mayor. But in all seriousness, these things could have been going on at the same time. It could have been happy coincidence. But we do know that her book did create a much stronger awareness nationally and locally of the sisters. Before I get to this book, there is a new biography of the sisters coming out in 2025, written by historian Lucy Knight. And there is I'll tell you in a minute about Francis Grimke. There's a biography of him coming up and possibly another one about Charlotte Fortin. I'll tell you about her in a minute. Well, I'll go ahead and say Charlotte Fortin was a Black woman in Philadelphia who ended up marrying Frank, and she was a poet, an educator, and activist. Okay, so this book, earlier this year, it's actually November when I got my copy. Carrie Greenidge, assistant professor of studies in race, colonialism, and diaspora at Tufts University, published The Grimkes, The Legacy of Slavery in an American Family, which tells the story of Sarah and Angelina's Black nephews and their families. And I'm writing the book review for this for the South Carolina Historical Society magazine. That'll be probably in 2024. So Sarah and Angelina's brother Henry had 3 children with an enslaved woman. Her name was Mary Weston, and the boys' names were Archibald, Francis, and John. So Archie is on the top, and then Francis they called Frank, and then John on the right. Sarah and Angelina only learned of them after the Civil War, when they were mentioned in a newspaper as attending Lincoln University, which was a school for freed slaves outside of Philadelphia. The sisters sought them out, developed a relationship with them, and paid for their graduate educations. Archie went to Harvard Law. Frank went to Princeton Theological Seminary. John's path is less clear. He kind of fell out of touch with the family for the most part. But Archie and Frank became part of what W.E.B. Du Bois would call the talented 10th, and what Greenidge and others call the Black elite during Reconstruction and immediately after Reconstruction. In addition to becoming a lawyer, Archie became the U.S. diplomat to the Dominican Republic. He was also the national vice president for the newly formed NAACP. Frank was a minister of a large Washington, D.C. Presbyterian church and also a founding member of the NAACP. Frank's wife, Charlotte Fortin, her family was a prominent Black family in Philadelphia after the Civil War, but before she married Frank, she went to South Carolina and became the first Black teacher there in what was known as the Port Royal experiment, where the federal government funded a school and other programs to help the newly freed slaves. Archie's daughter, who's pictured here, also called Angelina. They named her Angelina Weld Grimke, and Angelina Grimke Weld, her namesake. That's very confusing when you look them up. But Angelina became a poet and a playwright, just kind of right on the cusp of the Harlem Renaissance. So Greenidge examines their lives and their relationship with the sisters from the lens of the racial trauma suffered by the Black members of the family. But her book does have some flaws, and they're notable flaws, and I'll explain why. And I've just pulled out two, but there are more than this. So in 1835, Angelina sends a letter of support to William Lloyd Garrison, encouraging him to keep fighting for abolition after he was burned in effigy by a Charleston mob. And Garrison subsequently published that letter in his publication, The Liberator. And at the time, the sisters really wanted to be in that Quaker church. I mean, they were in that Quaker church, the Arch Street Church. And a leader of the church, Samuel Bedell, was not happy about the letter. And it kind of went against the official Quaker position. I mean, they were in principle anti-slavery. Their members could not hold slaves, but there were arguments on the question itself among different factions of the Quaker church. And Angelina, at least, was really frustrated by their inaction. And I'm sure he also felt that it was unseemly for a woman to write a public political letter. This was her first foray into politics here. Greenidge states, and you'll see here, that Bedell approached Angelina outside of Arch Street meeting and ordered her to repent. She ought to write to Garrison, he shouted, and stressed in no uncertain terms that she disavowed any support for abolitionist fanatics. This did not happen. In her diary, she writes, on the fourth day, so Quakers called Sunday the first day, so the fourth day is Wednesday. Bedell, quote, came to tell her the letter had been published. She writes that he was most exceedingly tried at my having written it, and he wished me to re-examine the letter. She says his visit was, I fully believe, prompted by the affection he bore me. So clearly he came to visit her. She was boarding in a house with another Quaker on a Wednesday and was exceedingly tried, but he didn't yell at her on the street outside of church. And it seems like a minor detail, but the mischaracterization kind of ignores what we know about Quakers and Quaker ideology, being guided by inner light and being generally peaceful people. Another example of a misrepresentation is her claim that Angelina wrote in her diary entry of June 4th, 1829, that white people are the, quote, leading race, and as such were supposed to uphold the spirit of God so they could minister successfully to the enslaved. Her diary does not say this. In that entry that is in question, June 4th, she's discussing her decision the previous night to speak on the subject of slavery. And when others said the slaves, quote, depravity made them only fit for slavery, she said, was it not white people who had placed them and kept them in this situation? So in other words, if slaves are not educated, who's keeping them uneducated, for example? So every book is going to have some mistakes. This one in particular mischaracterizes people in ways that could affect how the people are remembered. And how they are written about in the future. It's important, I think, to call these moments into question, while at the same time celebrating the fact that Greenidge has directed our attention, right, in such a way as to center the lives of the Black Grimkes, who have been in the historical shadow of the sisters for 50 years or more. It also opens the door a little more into understanding the lives of the Black children and grandchildren of this white planter class, how they lived, what sort of relationships were there, what did their lives look like at that time period, and then as the Civil War was happening and just afterward. It's very interesting stories to be told there. There's a lot more work to be done to create this clearer, fuller picture of 19th century Charleston and South Carolina. And I'm going to be busy doing that. So thank you. Let's see, I think that's it.